For this lab, we're going to create variable die lines, so a variety of die lines. In this case, I'm going to do 4 different die lines. I want to start out with a custom canvas size of a 4x4. So again, 4 inches by 4 inches. And I'm going to hit create. That gives me this square 4x4 canvas to work from. And the first one I'm going to create is going to be a rounded corner square. So I click the rectangle tool. And if I hover over the center, there's a little trick here that if I hover the center, find the center, and I click on Option and drag out at the same time as Shift, you'll see that it drags from the center and keeps it proportionate all the way around and keeps it centered in the canvas. So I'm going to aim for about a 3-inch. So I've got a 3-inch square, and if I look at my properties here again, I can fine tune it just a little bit and get rid of this here to make it exactly 3 inches. That way I've got a 3-inch box. And I'm going to do a couple of different things here. I'm going to round this corner a little bit so that we have radiused corners on the square so that it does not snag on objects as I have a label on my water bottle or some other type of object that's rounded so the corners don't start peeling. And so by using the direct select tool, you'll see that I get a little dot in here, which is actually a handle to pull a radius in. And if I want to pull it into a 1/4-inch radius, I can just pull till I get a 1/4-inch radius. So I've got a 3-inch square in this case with a 1/4-inch radius on the corners. So that makes it, again, so a little bit safer so the label doesn't get peeled off inadvertently or easily. After I have my corners rounded, I'm going to create a bleed line outside of this. So with the rectangle selected, or the square in this case selected, I'm going to go to Object, Path, Offset the path. So when I go Objects, Path, Offset the path, what I'm doing is creating a path outside of this that is going to be my area for my bleed mask. All right, so I want to do a 0.125 1/8-inch bleed outside of this. If I hit Preview, you'll see that it goes outside. When I hit OK, you'll notice that it created 2 rectangles. So one rectangle here is the one that is the inside. The inside is going to be my die line. So I'm going to name that die line. If I use a capital L, I'll be able to read that a little bit cleaner. So die line, and that designates what that particular function is. This next one that I've got selected now is going to be my bleed line. So I'm just going to name that bleed. There's no magic to the names. It's just helping me get organized. And in here, I'm going to call this one square radius. And the only reason I'm doing that again is to keep myself organized. And you'll notice that it is a printable and it's showing. And the die line and the bleed both need to be printable for it to be exported into Adobe Acrobat so that as a PDF, when we bring it into the next workflow, that it works right. All right, the next piece that I'm going to do is I'm going to select the one that is named the die line. It's the inner one here. And I'm going to go in and select a color swatch, and I'm going to create a custom color swatch called Cut Contour. The Cut Contour is what does the magic in the VersaWorks workflow on the Roland. So if I double click this magenta layer, that gives me a little bit more visibility, so I'm selecting magenta. So I'm going to call this one Cut Contour. And again, the name of this has to be very specific because the Roland is looking for this. Even though you say it's a printable layer, the Roland printer in the VersaWorks software will recognize this spot color that's named Cut Contour and say, no ink, that's where the blade cuts. All right, so now I've got these 2 pieces where I've got the inside, my cut contour path, and then I've got the outside layer, which is my bleed. So this gives me an 1/8-inch bleed outside of the area that it's going to cut. That way, if my image runs out beyond, everything is good and I don't have to worry about it. All right, the next piece that I have to do on this, though, is I have to create a mask. I want this to be the edge of the visible printable area. And I want this area out here not to print when I mask this over top of some type of an image. Whether that image be a fill or a Photoshop document or any other type of Illustrator document, I don't want that to print because I'm going to cut right here and there's no sense in printing beyond my bleed area. So there's a couple ways to do this. And one of the simplest ways to do this is to take your bleed line. I'm going to put this into a new layer, and I'm going to refer to this as my mask layer. And the bleed is going to go into the mask layer, and you'll see why momentarily. So in the bleed layer, I've got this mask, and the bleed here is going to be with zero fill. That way I can see through. So zero fill in here, I can see through it. And what I want to do is make this paper white out here. And I want it to be non-printing. So to do that, I'm going to create a new object on this layer in the mask layer. So above the bleed layer, I'm going to create a new object, which is a square. And again, I can draw that from the center. So I'm going to hold the Option key and Shift once again, and I'm going to drag all the way out to the edge of the artboard. When I release that, I'm actually out a little bit beyond, and that's okay. That will be clipped. I don't want a stroke on this. It's kind of irrelevant. What the color is doesn't really matter at this point, but ultimately I'm going to go with white. So let's put that. I'm going to leave it as a bright color so we can see it for now, so you can see what happens. But we're eventually going to go back to the paper white here, not the null, but the white. But if I look back at my layers here now, pull that out so it doesn't collapse on us. I'll put these below the layer so we can keep track of them. All right, so we can see that I've got this yellow selected. I'm going to put the bleed above the rectangle. So I'm going to drag that up in stacking order. And in this case, I'm going to have the die line is locked again, but I'm going to select these by shift click, the bleed and the rectangle together. So the rectangle is under the bleed. And now I'm going to use the Pathfinder tool. So Window Pathfinder. And within the Pathfinder, I'm going to select one that says to either minus the front or to divide. So I can intersect, minus, crop, and minus the front object. So compound shape, subtract the shape area. So if I click that, it's going to minus the shape in the center. So you can see that the yellow in the outside of the bleed area is going to be preserved. And now I can see through to this mask on the inside that's actually been cut through. So this is my bleed area. This is the die line area, and my image that I'm going to use on the sticker is right here. So just to make it so that I left that as yellow so that it make it a little bit clearer, but now I'm going to select this outside box only. So select the outside box with no stroke, and I'm going to turn it to paper white. It's a little bit hard to see this way, to see which one is which. To review the process, I'm going to create a new object. It'll make a star shape. So I'm going to create a new 4x4 object, hit create. Under the rectangle tool is a star tool, and I've already set it as a 5-point star. So if I find center and Option drag out from that, it gives me a somewhat concentric star. And if I go to properties here, I'm going to set this as a 3.5-inch width. And I'm going to tell it to be proportionate. So it expanded everything proportionate by clicking this link. All right, so I've got the star that I want. One of the things that I want to do on this one, again, is so I don't have sharp corners, is to make this snag-free path for my die line. So my outside die line is where I'm going to cut this. And so to get that to be rounded, I'm going to select the direct select tool and bring the points in. So now I've got a rounded star. It's not as sharp, it's not as extreme, so it's not going to catch things as easily. I can maybe bring that in just a little bit more. And then if I look at my layers, I've got one single object right now. I'm going to go to Object, Path, offset my path, and I'm going to do my 1/8-inch bleed once more. So if I look at that, it's going to put this outside line outside of that. This is the die line. This is the constraint of the bleed. So I hit OK there. This one is my die. And this one on the outside is my bleed. So again, I'm just naming them so that I can follow through a little bit easier. So this is what I've got. So in my die line, I'm going to select the die line. Again, I'm going to create this custom spot color as a spot. And again, the only reason I'm picking the magenta or the bright color is so that I can see it easier. In this case, I flipped the fill and the stroke, and I want the stroke to be a null, right? So now if I look at this in my swatches one more time, if I look at what the outside stroke is, it is this spot color called cut contour. Again, no space in the name, all right? I've got this outside bleed area that I'm doing right now only with a stroke on it so that I can see it. And then I'm going to create my mask layer again. There's nothing magic. You're not making a mask in the sense of selecting two objects, making a mask like you do in Illustrator. But in here, I'm going to take my bleed line, put it back up into that. I'm going to lock this layer. In my mask layer, I've got this bleed. And the bleed has a fill, so we can get rid of that fill. So it turns into a null. And again, I'm just going to create an object, a square, over top of the entire object. So I have a square that has a white fill, and no stroke. Okay, white fill and no stroke, it's really hard to see, but if I hit Command Y, you'll see that I have this star in here. Again, it's always important to do Command Y to preview what you're going to be cutting. And if I zoom in on this, I want to make sure that I have a single line and no double stroke. So I've got a single line here and a single line here. If I would have inadvertently expanded the stroke, I would end up with double or a triple line, and that would be a path that my blade would cut twice, and that's not a very effective way to do this. So if I come back into the view, I'm going to select this rectangle and put the bleed above it, select both of them together, and with the pathfinder, I'm going to go in and again, I can do the minus the front object. So when I minus the front, I can see through this. And if I select the outside edge of this, again, this is the rectangle on the outside, I can proof this out by seeing that color and say, okay, I can actually see through that. This is the mask layer. There's my die line. And I'm going to convert my mask back to the white. So mask as white. And this is a compound path now. So that becomes my bleed, my mask with my compound path for the bleed outside of that. All right, if I hit save, Command Shift S, and I'm going to call this one my star, and I'm going to put that into this as a star die line, and again I'm replacing that because I already had it in there. Hit OK, and you'll repeat the process for 3 different ones. For example, I would do a round or an oval, I could do a triangle, or I could do some random freeform shape with a pen tool that follows a path of a contour of a balloon cutout or a tree, or most anything I want to. So we will continue with this. I'll make 2 more, and then we'll be using those in the variable data workflow, placing the die lines in InDesign in the next project.